Good evening. Thank you for joining us for another of our Atelier Artworks online lectures. Before we begin, I should like to give you some information about the Atelier at Flowerfield, a 501(c) not-for-profit organization. We've just started our Fall 2 session, which will run for 4 weeks, so it's still not too late to sign up. We offer a variety of fine art, drawing and painting classes in a variety of mediums, both online and in studio, for all ages and abilities. In addition, we offer classes in illustration and digital painting. We offer both evening and day classes, as well as weekend classes. We have a large collection of paintings on sale on our online art shop. We have a mixture of watercolors, oils, and 1 or 2 prints. Details can be found on our website, theatelieratflowerfield.org. Our current exhibition is a solo show of works by our instructor, Bill Graff. The gallery is open 9 to 5, Monday through Saturday. Tonight's lecture is being sponsored by First Republic Private Wealth Management. And tonight, Helen Harrison, director of the Pollock-Kranser House, is presenting a lecture, Hamptons Bohemia, 2 Centuries of Artists and Writers on the Beach. We welcome her this evening and hope you enjoy tonight's talk. If you wish to ask questions, please post them in the chat room. Thank you. I shall now hand over to Helen Harrison.
Thank you very much, Gabby. Thanks both to you and to Brianna for inviting me back. It's really a pleasure. And I want to start off by just explaining a little bit about the book. I'm going to share my screen. And here we are. This is a book that I wrote or was published in 2002, but the material on which it's based was actually put together for the 350th anniversary of the town of East Hampton, which was celebrated in 1998. And I gave a lecture on the artists of the area, and Constance Denny, who was my co-author on this book, gave a talk about the writers. So those lectures were published in a volume that was published by the East Hampton Library and the Historical Society. And it was read by a guy named Joe Mintzer. And Joe thought that the 2 essays together, if they were combined and expanded, would make a very interesting history of the creative community of the Hamptons. So he came to me and asked me if I would do that. And I said, you know, it's funny you ask that, Joe, because I've been asked by Rizzoli to do a book just about the artists. So he was a little disappointed, but then the project fell through. And one of the people who had worked for Rizzoli thought that it would be a great idea. So he was approached and he decided to package the book. So this was actually put together by Sideshow Media, or Sideshow Books as it was known then, a wonderful editor and book packager named Dan Tucker. And he sold it to Chronicle Books in San Francisco, of all places. It seems so odd that a book about the East Coast should be published by a West Coast publisher, but that was their choice. They loved it, and it was brought out in 2002. Connie and I did not know each other. We had never met, but it was really a wonderful collaboration. And we had an editor who put the 2 streams of information together so seamlessly that it seemed almost as if it had been written by a single person. I was very impressed. And the designer of the book, it's a picture book, but it has a lot of information in it. And you know, very often when you read art books, there'll be a whole area of text, and then there'll be plates. So the plates will be separate from the text. Well, this designer, actually Patricia Fabricant, worked so well at integrating the imagery and the text that it flows seamlessly, so that on each page where an artwork is mentioned or discussed, it's illustrated. So you don't have to be flipping back and forth between the sections with the plates and the sections with the text. And it's just, I thought the design was really quite brilliant. And I have to thank Patty for that, because I had nothing to do with it. But I wanted to start by dispelling a myth. The myth is that the art community really began after World War II, when the abstract expressionists came out. Or, well, maybe it happened in the late 19th century when the American Impressionists came out. No, there were artists who were born here and lived here in the 18th and early 19th century. And even before that, there were indigenous artists. So we tried very hard to take it back as far as we could with the visual evidence, with the evidence that has survived. Sadly, oh, I should mention also, Edward Albee was very generous to write the introduction. I don't know how much you know about Edward's career, but he, after he had a great success with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf on Broadway and actually got a little money, he was able to buy a place in Montauk. And he always felt that this was a wonderful place for him to recharge his creative batteries. And he also established an artist residency in Montauk for artists and writers, which is still actually going today. And it's a terrific legacy of his, but he was extremely generous and enthusiastic about the book. So, indigenous artists. The only evidence of Native American creative art that we could find, apart from decorations on pottery and things of that kind, was this amulet, or we don't really know quite what its function was, but you can see here, if I can point them out, these two little perforations. It's slate, and it was found in Montauk, and it evidently had some kind of ceremonial purpose. It's only about 4 inches tall, but it is, as far as we know, the only piece of Native American indigenous art that has survived or has been located up to this point. So there was creative activity here before white settlement, but during the colonial period and the early 19th century, there were artists who were born here who were plying their trade either as portraitists or as landscape painters. And probably the earliest one was Abraham Tuttle, who was born in Orient, or as it was known then, Oyster Ponds on the North Fork. And he, as you can see, was a colonial limner, not terribly well versed. He did actually study in New York City and was supposed to go to England to study with Benjamin West, but we think that he probably didn't. But in any event, he made a living as a portrait painter, itinerant, in New York City, in New England, and out here. So he was really one of the very first to be recognized as an artist. A Sag Harbor native, Orlando Hand Beers. And I just love this little portrait of his son. And, you know, people say, oh, isn't that a girl? Well, no, look at his haircut. It's a little boy that they used to dress them in dresses in those days with this very fanciful, believe me, we have no mountains in Sag Harbor, very fanciful landscape in the background, although one of our local churches with its spire is definitely there. But the oak leaf that the little Alfred holds is a symbol of strength and longevity. See it down here on the lower border. Sadly, the little boy died quite young. So it's kind of a very tragic portrait as well. Now, I am not really going to talk very much about the writers because that's really not my specialty. I don't know an awful lot about them, except what Connie put in the book. But she was able to identify some very early writers, including Catherine Beecher, who was one of the, the famous Lyman Beecher, the famous preacher Beecher, who established the Presbyterian Church in in East Hampton. He had 13 children. He also, Henry Ward Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the daughter, Catherine Beecher, was quite a well-known writer. She wrote a treatise on domestic economy in 1841 that was very well received. And Cornelia Huntington was East Hampton's first novelist. In the mid-19th century, she wrote a book called Sea Spray, and it was published under a pseudonym. I think it was considered perhaps not ladylike to be writing literary fiction. But it wasn't all that fictional. It was actually a veiled portrait of East Hampton, which she described as a sad, dull place in the wintertime. Because the great temperance reform had made everything that was fun outmoded and illegal, and dealt the death blow to dancing, as she put it. But that novel was published in 1857, although it had been written earlier. But that was the very first work of fiction that we know of that was published in East Hampton. Of course, Walt Whitman, we're all familiar with his work, and of course his birthplace in Huntington. He was the great writer of, as he called it, fish-shaped Paumanok, which was another name for Long Island, and Olivia Ward Bushbanks, who was born in Sag Harbor, but as an infant was taken to grow up in Rhode Island. She was part Native American and part African American, and her writings, her poetry, and her prose celebrated her dual heritage. She was perhaps, I guess, best known. Let me see if I can find a nice quote about her here. She wrote quite eloquently about the plight of the Native Americans, and she, as you can see, she lived until 1944. But all of these people were practicing their art on Long Island before the coming of the railroad, and that changed everything. In 1870, the railroad came to the South Fork. It had gone to the North Fork quite a bit earlier, 1844, but it came to Bridgehampton, and then there was a spur to Sag Harbor. Sag Harbor was the port. It also, of course, it was the center of the whaling industry, which by then was very much on the wane, but it was the port where goods from Connecticut and farther afield were brought and then loaded onto the train and then taken into the city. So the advent of the railroad opened up the area not only for tourism and for commerce, but for artistic exploitation. Winslow Homer was one of the earliest to come. He did this beach, there were 2 beach paintings that we know of that he did. And what you can see, I think it's kind of wonderful. It's a little hard to make out, but you can tell these people are fully dressed. They are not wearing bathing suits. These people, I mean, they must have been dreadfully uncomfortable, but this was a day out at the beach. And in the background here, you see all these carriages. They would drive the carriages with the horses and everything that the horses left behind right down to the water. They had portable cabanas. You can see one of them here that they would park on the beach and they would rent them out for people to change into their swimming costumes. But out here in the water, what you can't see, they would string ropes out into the water and pin them down on the beach, so that people, because they were wearing such heavy swimming costumes, they were literally fully dressed with big floating skirts and things, they would get swept away if they didn't have a rope to hang on to. So it was really quite an ordeal, I think, going to the beach back in those days. And as you can see, the traffic was pretty terrible. Well, in 1878, an association of artists that was formed in New York City the previous year, called the Tile Club, decided to make an excursion to Eastern Long Island. And one of their members, this was a loosely knit group who would first meet in one another's studios, and then eventually they got a clubhouse of their own. And the excuse was to paint on Minton tiles. And so they would have the tiles fired, and then it was kind of an arts and crafts pastime. But the real purpose was to get together to drink and have conviviality. And one of their members was evidently a professional by profession. He was sort of an amateur artist, but he was a professional ticket agent for the Long Island Railroad. And he dreamed up the scheme to get the artists to take the train out to the East End and to chronicle their journey. as an article that he could sell to the Scribner's magazine, but also as a way to drum up business for the railroad. So it was kind of like an advertorial. So they did that in the summer of 1878, and they did their sketching and everything on the way out. And then the goal, the destination, was Home Sweet Home, which was supposedly John Howard Payne's childhood home, the one that he celebrated in the song. But in fact, he was born in New York City. But apparently relatives did live there. So this was a very picturesque, and still is. It's actually a village-owned museum, but a picturesque subject that the artist wanted to draw and paint. So they would set up their easels either on the grounds of some of these charming local attractions, or they would go off onto the beach or someplace where they could do the landscape or the farmsteads or something that they would then take back to New York City and sell in their New York City galleries or from their New York studios. So here's a group of them by Edwin Austin Albee, who was one of their number, and shows the sketching expedition that was in the summer of 1878, published the following year. Well, one of the people who heard about this, who was not a Tile Club member, but was a friend of theirs, was Thomas Moran. He was the famous painter of the Yellowstone, but he heard about the picturesque beauty of East Hampton. He and his wife, Mary, who was a prominent etcher, came out and visited in 1882, and then decided to buy property and build a purpose-built artist's home and studio on Main Street at East Hampton. And there you see it. It's called, appropriately enough, the Studio. And it was built in 1884. It is still there. It's a National Historic Landmark, and it is open to the public on a limited basis, but it's been exquisitely restored, and it is a real gem. And as I say, the very first one. So it has a kind of iconic status because, as you can see from the picture of the whole group there, most of the people in that photograph are relatives of the Morans, and many of them are also artists. I believe there were 16 in all, sisters, brothers, cousins, who all were either fine artists or illustrators. And whenever they would get together at the studio, they had a kind of built-in art colony. So it helped to both spread the word about the attractiveness of the area and also to populate the area with a lot of practicing artists. Some of them would stay in a boarding house across the street, which became Mural, because the boys used to sing their drinking songs, and it unfortunately was right next door to the Presbyterian church. So that kind of scandalized the neighborhood, but they had a lot of fun. And there's now a restaurant called Rowdy Hall in East Hampton that kind of memorializes that occasion. Here are some works by them. Thomas Moran, as I said, was the painter of the Yellowstone, but he was very well known for his atmospheric effects. And back in those days, East Hampton was very rural, very bucolic. And you can see there are cows in Town Pond and this wonderful rustic bridge leading across one of the, there are several of what they call kettle holes, which will lead down to the beach. And this is when the key came home, it's when the cows come home. And you can see the beautiful sunset. It's just a really atmospheric and very attractive scenery that the artists of that generation were seeking. One of the Tile Club members was William Merritt Chase. And a few years after the Tile Club visit, he was invited by a number of prominent local citizens of Southampton to establish an art colony, which would be a summer school. And it was America's first plein air summer school, and it was called the Shinnecock Summer School of Art. And it operated for 11 years. The village, which was built by these investors to house the summer visitors who would come to sign up at the school. This large building that you see in the postcard image right here, this was a studio, purpose-built studio that was used on rainy days and also when they would have their critiques. Because normally they would paint outdoors. As you can see, Chase is there correcting one of the students' works. And many of the students were female, although not entirely. But if the weather was inclement, they would go indoors to the big studio. And then when they all came together after they'd been out in the landscape doing their work, they would bring their things to a weekly critique. And then Chase would go around and discuss each one's work. And the village itself, you can see the plan of it. That was a real, like a purpose-built art colony, but it only operated in the summer. Some art colonies arise naturally just because artists are one artist goes, another artist follows, and others are established, like Woodstock. Woodstock was established in 1902 specifically as an artist retreat. So this was the art village, and there was a separate building for Chase to live in. He had a very large family. I think there were 12 children, and he and his wife lived in a separate, about a mile away, designed by Stanford White. And that building still survives, although it is a private home. It's not open to the public. Another very prominent member, and also a Child Club member, Child Hassan, came in 1898 to visit a friend who had a home here, and decided that it was so beautiful that he would like to have a home here too. And as I say, this is always often the case, that one artist will establish a foothold and then invite others to visit, and then pretty soon there goes the neighborhood. But this is Home Sweet Home, which is the original John Howard Payne destination, even though, as I said, but Hassan was absolutely taken with the wonderful colonial homes. His name sounds kind of Middle Eastern, Hassan, but it was actually a corruption of the name Horsham, which is English. And he said that these English cottages and the windmills, it's English style smock mills, that they were, real old East Hampton, and that they should always survive. And of course, many of them do survive, although the atmosphere, the environment has changed out of all recognition. Hassan would probably, he's rolling in his grave. But, we think also that the giant estates and these enormous McMansions are a novelty. But in fact, there were many of them back at the turn of the 20th century. And one of the most palatial was called Dunes. It belonged to the Wyborg family. And you can see the Italianate gardens, how elaborate they are. This was right on the beach, actually, right south of East Hampton Village. It's in the village, but very, very isolated in its own environment, with these extremely elaborate formal gardens. And many of these houses were demolished during the Depression. They couldn't keep them up. The Dunes is long gone, but it belonged to the family of Sarah and Gerald Murphy. Gerald Murphy's, he was an expat, went to live in Paris and in the south of France, and became an associate of Picasso, very close to the artists of the day in the 1920s. But when the Depression hit, Mark Cross was having trouble, and he had to come back to the US to help run the business. And of course, at that point, many of the other people in Europe were coming back to the United States as well, like Peggy Guggenheim, for example. But World War II really set the seal on that. And one of the people who came as a guest of Sarah and Gerald, and here you see Sarah, and this is Fernand Léger. Oh, sorry, this is Sarah, Fernand Léger, and Ada McLeish, Archibald McLeish's wife. And Léger dressed up like a Christmas tree with all this tinsel. They were obviously having a costume party, but they would entertain quite lavishly. Léger was here temporarily, but the woman with whom he was living at the time, who was named Lucia Cristofonetti, after the war, she stayed. And she was one of the very earliest of the group who were here during the war period, but who didn't leave. And of course, the war and the Depression were kind of the double whammy for the Hamptons, because even then it was strongly dependent on tourism and of course also fishing. Fuel was rationed. It was difficult to do the fishing, and of course people weren't coming out as tourists anymore. So the colony kind of went on a downswing. But during the war, these expats came over, and Leger was one of them. And his wife, his girlfriend or lover with whom he was living, Lucia, this is she right here on the left. And they were all friends with the Surrealists in Paris. And so when they came out, some of the Surrealists followed, including Matt and some of their, so Amagansett became kind of the epicenter. I don't know exactly why. I guess it was very convenient on the train, and it was somewhat off the beaten track, not as fancy as East Hampton. So they perhaps felt more comfortable here. And they certainly, as you can see, were being very comfortable. According to legend, the women would fashion a kind of makeshift bikinis because they were definitely not used to big, heavy American swimsuits. And they would have these little two-piece outfits and go down to the beach and scandalize the were having scandalizing people. And so tourists would arrive looking for the Surrealists. But this was a very brief interlude, because once the war was over, most of them did return to Europe. Now, two of the people who came out during that period just to visit, they had some friends who were renting in Amagansett, and Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner decided to club in with them for the summer. Normally, the avant-garde would have gone to Provincetown, because that was where Hans Hofmann had his school. Hofmann was teaching the principles of Cubism. He'd had it in New York City since 1934 and established an outpost in Provincetown for the summer. And a lot of the students would migrate with him up to the Cape. And Jackson Lee did that a couple of times, although Jackson never studied with him. Lee did from 1937 to 1940. But they didn't have enough money to go to the Cape in the summer of 1945. So they had some friends who were renting on Louse Point, which is sort of halfway between Springs and Amagansett. And the friends said, well, you can come and share with us. So they did. And Lee got the idea that they should move out there for the winter. Now, this was in those days a community of 300 farmers and fisher folk. I mean, there were no other artists. And it was very much a working class backwater. No, not connected to the art world at all. But that was the point, because Pollock was right at the beginning of his career, and he was an alcoholic, and he was having trouble keeping on track. So Lee thought that if she could isolate him, that he would become more productive. And in fact, it worked. But he said, I don't think we should just go out there for the winter. I think we should move there. He was a country boy in his youth. He grew up on farms in California and Arizona, although he'd lived in New York City since he was 18. So he was not exactly a country bumpkin. But he thought that they should get married and settle down. Well, because they didn't have any to buy a house. After all, they hadn't even been able to go to the Cape for the summer. But they had to convince his patron, Peggy Guggenheim, to lend them the down payment on the house, which you see on the left, which was really pretty much a handyman special. It was built in 1879, and it had no plumbing or central heating when they moved in. So they had to do quite a bit of renovation. But Peggy did lend them the down payment, and they moved in 1945, in November of all things, and they lived there for the rest of their lives. So they became the magnet that attracted many of their fellow artists. to visit, and pretty soon they would start buying and fixing things up in the neighborhood. Here's some examples of their work. You can see how nature played a role in their imagery. Both of them had really significant breakthroughs when they moved to the country. And Pollock's series called Sounds in the Grass, of which this croaking movement is a really wonderful example, is in Peggy Guggenheim's collection, in fact, in Venice, is just replete with his very subjective, very personal reaction to the environment. There's a whole series of them named after natural phenomena. And he chose those names himself. So you have croaking movement, eyes in the heat, sounds in the grass, earthworms. So they're all references to nature without being literal. Lee's painting, done shortly after Pollock's death, called Thaw, you can see that it almost looks like ice is melting and plants are growing up, things are pushing through the snow. You know, it has a feeling of regeneration and growth. Again, without being specific, without referencing a particular flower or leaf or growing thing, but just responsive to the natural surroundings and inspired by the environment. And you know, people think of these works as being so very abstract, and what do they mean? Well, they don't have a specific meaning. But they have imagery that is suggestive of its inspiration, and imagined it in his or her own language. Actually, Robert Motherwell was one of the first to suggest that Springs would be a good place for the artists. He had come out with the Surrealists in 1945, and he really thought that being off the beaten track, not in the resort area, not in the art colony area that was down in the village, but being out more isolated would be more conducive for the artist to concentrate. So he said he thought Springs was the place to settle. But ironically, he wound up down in the village in Georgia, which is a kind of exclusive area. But he built this very eccentric home designed by Pierre Charot, made out of war surplus Quonset huts. So there was a Quonset hut for the house and a separate Quonset hut for the studio. But the house was excavated below grade. So if you look here in the photo of him standing in his living room, you see where the window is, like halfway up the wall. And here, if you look on the right, you see the window is at grade level. So half the house was underground. And the second floor, which there's an entrance over here, that was where the bedrooms were. But the studio was actually a separate building. And this, of course, scandalized the neighbors because Georgia was full of neo-colonial and shingle style houses. So this was very much out of place in that neighborhood. And the house is no longer there. It was demolished in the 1980s. But it was, when it was sold, the owners didn't want it. They said they were going to knock it down. And they said, well, anyone who can move it can have it. And I was working at Guildhall Museum at the time, and we put in a bid for it. And they said, sure, just take it away. And we were going to put it on a piece of property that one of our trustees owned. But the cost of removing it would, like taking down a cathedral, every brick would have to be numbered. And the whole thing was so complicated and expensive that we wound up not doing it, and the building was lost, unfortunately. But here are some of the others who followed in their wake. You've got Bill and Elaine de Kooning. In a photograph of them, you see them standing on the porch of Leo Castelli's house, which was also in Georgia in 1953. They had first come to visit Jackson and Lee in 1948. But they didn't wind up getting a place of their own until, I think, 55, when they got a cottage that belonged to Elaine's brother opposite the cemetery in Springs. And that is still in the family. But years later, in 1963, after he and Elaine split up, Bill built a purpose-built studio in Springs on Woodbine Drive, and that building is still there as well. Nicholas Caron, who was another somewhat younger member of the group, they were over in 3 Mile Harbor. Ibram Lassaw, the sculptor, He built a Butler building, which was a purpose-built adaptation of a commercial building on his property in Springs. Conrad Marcarelli, who's on the lower right here. This is Conrad. He lived right next door to Jackson and Lee in a wonderful, eccentric old building that he renovated. It was not a studio per se, it was an older building, but he made it very interesting and added to it. But that's what they often did. They would buy and customize it. Joan Mitchell, she never actually owned any property in the neighborhood, but she spent 2 summers here. And there she is with her standard poodle, George, whom she loved dearly, and who is the subject of one of her paintings, or at least it's titled for him, but it's actually not a portrait of a dog. Then Southampton had its own cadre. Of course, William Merritt Chase's art school was there, but that had closed, I believe it was 1911 was its last year. But there were other artists coming to Southampton, most notably Fairfield Porter, who bought a house on Main Street in 1949, partly because he wanted to educate his children and not in the city. But here, like Jackson and Lee, he and his wife Anne, who was a poet, attracted lots of their artist friends, and the house was big, and so they often had house guests or people who would rent cheaply in the neighborhood. And on the right, you see some of them. Well, Jane Freilicher was a close friend of his, and there she is in the summer of 1951 with the poet John Ashbery and Kenneth Koch, Lelia Katayan, who was a dancer, and also Nell Blaine, a painter, and Larry Rivers in a summer rental. Rivers eventually wound up buying a place on Little Plains Road. Jane Freilicher was down on Cobb. No, she was in Flying Point. So they would get a taste for the place, and then they would find a place of their own. And here is one of their many legendary social gatherings. Leo Castelli, the art dealer, had bought a place in 1951, which is in Georgia, and that's where this party was held. You can see Porter is there, the sculptor David Hare, Bill and Elaine de Kooning, Harold Rosenberg, the art critic, Mary Abbott, the painter, May Rosenberg, Harold's wife, she was a novelist. So you can see the artists and the writers were very much in the same social circles. And of course, John Steinbeck famously settled in Sag Harbor, and his little writing studio, which is out behind his house, it was called Joyous Guard. And it is now on the market, but we are hoping to save it and open the property as a writer's retreat. So he started his travels with Charlie from Sag Harbor. And he always said that Sag Harbor, the same way that Edward Albee felt about Montauk, that it was where he went to kind of regenerate himself as a writer, to clear his head, so to speak. And A.J. Liebling, the sports writer, and Jean Stafford, his wife, they were also up in Springs. And it was just a very relaxed atmosphere and pleasant for socializing, but also you could close the door and get things done without being bothered too much. So it wasn't a day where you were constantly having to perform and show up. It was much more relaxed. But there were signs in the 1950s that the times were changing, and that abstract art was really what was the cutting edge, that it was no longer the landscape painters and the portrait painters that were the dominant force, although there were still plenty of naturalistic painters in the area. But Guildhall, our local museum, where I used to be the curator, was apparently not as responsive as some of the more avant-garde artists would have liked. So in 1957, 3 of them got together and opened a gallery, which was a showcase and a sales room for more advanced art. It was called the Cigna Gallery, as in sign of the times. This is its final iteration. Its original location was on Main Street. And it was opened by these three people: Alfonso Osorio, he of the Hawaiian shirt, and Elizabeth Parker, and John Little. So they were three artists who partnered together to create this gallery. It was in operation for 4 years, and it became something of a phenomenon because it was not just local, it was international. They had artists from Europe, artists from Asia, as well as Americans. So it was a mix and match of the avant-garde on an international level, and that was new. And unfortunately, it was a commercial failure. I mean, they did sell. Alfonso told me that they pretty much broke even, but it wasn't a runaway success. And he also said that they had hoped to bring along a new generation of collectors and enthusiasts, but they were pretty much preaching to the choir. So that anybody who bought things was already converted. So after 4 years, they just felt that they were either going to have to be more aggressive commercially, or they were going to have to go back to their own studios and do their own art. And that's actually what they wound up doing. But while it was there, it was really quite an impressive. You have a younger generation coming along. And in this photograph that was taken at a 4th of July party at the home of this man, where is he? Louis Shanker, and his wife, Libby Holman, who was a singer and a very successful one, quite wealthy. They had a beautiful beach house in Amagansett, and this party was a house party. You can see they're all dressed in their street clothes. But after a second round of cocktails, they decided it would be a great idea to go down to the beach and have their picture taken. And one of the guests happened to be Hans Namath, who took this photograph of them. And you can see the older generation over here on the left. You have Lee Krasner, Malcolm Green, Buffy Johnson, and then some Jane Freilicher, Jane Wilson over here on the right. So it's kind of an interesting transition between the two. But unfortunately, sadly, everyone in this photograph is now deceased. So the 50s, the 60s kind of, things started to proliferate, and art forms of other types, not just painting and sculpture, started to be get noticed. And one of them was happenings, thanks to Alan Capro, whom you see here on the lower right, the man with the beard, being interviewed for a CBS television program called What I Did on My Vacation. And it was sort of like a PBS Canvas segment would be today, where they went out with cameras and they took film of this happening, which was called Gas. And it was all different kinds of things that got inflated. So here you had Alan Capro as Captain something or other, I've forgotten, but anyway, riding a hovercraft. So this thing was being blown along on air. And then you had a firefighting foam being pushed into the dump by 55-gallon drums. And the person in this photograph pushing it is the architectural historian and critic, Alistair Gordon, as a teenager. Then you had an inflatable on the beach. So all of this was going on over several days. And this kind of signaled how there was a new avant-garde that was moving expressionism. And of course, the pop artists started coming. Roy Lichtenstein, I think 1971 or 72, established his studio in Southampton. Chuck Close was in Bridgehampton. And out in Montauk, Andy Warhol had bought property, and it's a wonderful estate called Eothen, which means to the east. And he did this sunset prints. It actually looks it's almost a 300-degree view, and he looks both to the east and to the west. And the sunset prints were apparently inspired by his time there, although he didn't spend a lot of time there. It was really his partner, Paul Morrissey, who was, I guess, the primary investor. But Andy would go out for weekends and he would hang out there with his friends, but he never really had a studio there. The one person who did have a studio there in the squash court of this, several building complex was Julian Schnabel, who eventually wound up getting his own property in Montauk. But there were many famous visitors, including, as you can see, Mick Jagger and Catherine Deneuve. Halston apparently spent time there, and all the Rolling Stones were there at one point. And in 1972, Guildhall sponsored a kind of paint-in, I guess you'd call it. There was a group that wanted to raise money for the McGovern's presidential campaign, and they decided to paint a group painting, which they called the Mural, to be auctioned. So Wilfred Zogbaum, one of the sculptors, had a big concrete pad out behind his barn, and that's where they did it. And then they auctioned it off, and the person who bought it donated it to Guildhall. And there's a picture of it. I think there were about 35 artists altogether, but if you hang that, and it's, as you can see, quite large, when Guildhall does hang it, it's basically a group show of the artists of the Hamptons at that time. Some of the other writers Betty Friedan was very active in the local community in Sag Harbor. In fact, she actually founded a kind of think tank that helped to perpetuate an intellectual discourse in the area. Unfortunately, it was fairly short-lived, and once she died, I think it just went away of its own accord. But she, of course, was a very well-known writer and activist in the feminist movement. Bob Caro, seen there with Kurt Vonnegut, he was in Sagaponack, and of course, Bob is still with us, and E.L. Doctorow in Sag Harbor. So there really was quite a diverse community. And here are some of the ones who are here today. Now, the book came out in 2002, so that's when it ends. And it ended with people like Robert Wilson and Laurie Anderson and Julian. These people came in the 80s, 90s, and up to 2000. But they're all still here. And I think that it's interesting that the creative community has not diminished, it's increased. And even today, there are still a lot of indigenous artists, people who have were born here, grown up here, and still practice their art today. Not just the famous ones. I'm just showing you pictures of the famous ones, but the ones who are just, workaday artists doing their thing in the local community. And actually, recently in Springs, we have a little community center called Ashua Hall, where we have exhibitions, and the Historical Society did a show that was kind of a Springs together, said, okay, I'm going to have an art show of artists who just live in Springs, which is a very discrete hamlet within the town of East Hampton. And I went to see the exhibition, and she had 50 artists in it. And I said, and these are all in Springs? And she said, I had to leave some out. So that tells you how big and how active and how diverse the art community still is today. Oops, I'm not going forward here. So I'm going to end with Springs Cemetery, Green River, just to say that there are a number of permanent residents in this is where Jackson and Lee are buried, as you can see. And it is our little Père Lachaise where our notables are. And it's really a testament to the strength of the art community and the persistence of it, that even today, people are still wanting to move here and work here and live here and be part of this wonderful community that's been going since the 1870s, the oldest continuously functioning art colony in the United States. So I would be very happy to take questions if anyone has anything that they'd like me to elaborate on, or that they would like me to talk about that I didn't. Please just put them in the chat.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, does anyone have any questions? Put them in the chat room and I will read them off to Helen. We'll give it a couple of minutes for people to think about it, and Does anyone have any questions they would like to have answered?
Well, it's a lot of material to cover, and so I gave them a lot to think about, but maybe that was enough.
Yes, indeed. You never know. Anybody?
Oh, I will say that the book is long out of print, I'm sorry to say, but it is available on some of the aggregator sites like Abe Books and Bookfinder. Be interested in it, it can be bought secondhand.
Okay, if no one has any more questions, I think I would like to thank Helen Harrison for giving such an interesting talk on the artists and writers in the Hamptons. We hope you found it both engaging and informative. And we should also like to thank First Republic Private Wealth Management for their generous support of tonight's program. We're still firming up the date for the next lecture, which we hope to have decided by sometime next week, if possible. We will send emails out about it, so please look out for the emails. And for our other events and classes going through the autumn. And just a reminder that Liz Fusco is doing a workshop on the 23rd of October. It's Autumn Leaves, Botanical Illustration. We still have a few places available for that one. So if anyone is interested in signing up, please give us a call, or you can do so online. Thank you very much, Helen, again. And
thank you, Gabby. It's been a pleasure. And thanks also to Brianna for her help.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.